Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm finally talking about the new album from Jamie XX, In Waves. Alright then, Jamie XX. Oh god, that's even getting me eye strain in real life. So I don't think it's going to surprise many people to hear that this was my most anticipated album of the entire year. Well, perhaps depending on which old videos of mine you've seen, that might seem like more of a surprise to some than others. Like, I'm not gonna say I was ever a super crazy in-depth fan of the XX back when they were a thing on the indie alternative scene in the early 2010s. They made really moody and downbeat indie pop, which I generally liked what I heard of from random recommendations from like Pandora and stuff, and I did quite like their sort of comeback record I See You in 2017, but I wouldn't say they ever interested me enough at the time they broke out to really get invested in beyond the most surface level. Seemed a little out of my format, as it were. Nor was I really paying attention when the group's main producer Jamie Smith started to break out as a solo artist under the name Jamie XX, making a full album of remixes of Gail Scott Heron's final album, even if I might have heard offhand that one of those remixes got sampled in a Drake song or something. But still, the XX were just enough on my radar when I saw Jamie XX coming out with his debut solo album In Color in 2015, which not only charted high on iTunes during a time when that actually meant something, but was also one of those once-in-a-blue-moon big event electronic projects out at the time that was being talked about enough for the YouTube critics I followed, like Spectrum Pulse, ARTV, and Anthony Fantano, to be willing to review. So as someone who is just starting to be inspired by those guys to make a review channel of my own following after them, I decided to also throw my own hat in the ring and dedicate my own second ever review on this very channel to it. That video is still up, and I do have it linked in the description if you're morbidly curious. Fair warning, I was only 19 and basically just riffing off the top of my head. Obviously had no idea on how to write or structure reviews yet, let alone know what to do with my face or hands while on camera. That was honestly less overtly cringe than I'd expected it to be looking back on it, so yeah. Now, at the time, I thought In Color was in fact great. It was a mix of sounds and influences that I hadn't heard combined together, feeling like a crossroads between the moody sample chops and heavy garage beat work associated with an artist like Burial, and the breezy, playful, and nostalgic down-tempo trip-hop sort of sound that one might hear out of an outfit like Bent. Two comparison points which at the time I never would have expected to bring up at all, let alone together on the same record. And even if it wasn't necessarily an album that really knocked my socks off immediately, it was one that stuck in my mind and ended up marking as one of my favorite albums of the year when I put out my first year-end list in 2015. With that said, as much as I messed with that album back when it was new, all the years of hindsight in the near decade that has followed since that album's release has done nothing but highlight just how much of a special moment for electronic music as a whole that one album really was. Not just after enough time had passed where I could more easily look at the 2010s decade in a more macro sense and see how that album both perfectly captured the time but also felt like a step forward into something new, something that felt contemporary, could fit into current trends, and became properly influential on the scene as lots of people tried to replicate its successes and yet nobody could really pull it off in quite the same way. But also, as the album continued to grow on me further and further, it became more of an actual nostalgia point. I got a lot more of an actual emotional attachment to it, as all the minor things that I might have nitpicked about back then, like the Young Thug appearance or the abrupt hard cut at the end of Girl or that kind of thing, eventually all stopped bothering me and I warmed up to how they were handled as is. When I redid my 2015 list for a subscriber milestone in 2020, it got upgraded to my #1 favorite album of that year. And by the time last year rolled around, I realized it wasn't just a regular old great album, it had entered into the echelon of proper all-time favorites. Like, at the time I scored it an 8.3, but if I were to score that album now, it'd be like a 9.3. In Color is taken on a level of weight and importance, both on a personal level and in the greater context of electronic music as a whole, that I never could have anticipated back in the day when I actually reviewed it. So, of course, the fact that 9 years passed without a follow-up album made me feel that absence all the more. Well, obviously, it's not like Jamie XX ever left the public eye or anything in the years since. He had put out loose singles here and there, especially after the pandemic hit, which were all solid enough bangers that showed more of his eclectic tastes for old-school rave revivalism. Well, okay, I will admit I did not care for Kill Dem. That one was just kind of annoying, and you do not need to go out of your way to hear it if it hasn't reached you via smartphone ads already. But I Don't Know and It's So Good were really fun and went on all sorts of crazy twists and turns, and Let's Do It Again was a fun, lengthy solar gospel sampling endeavor as well. And of course, we can't forget how he showed up to absolutely knock out guest features in this span of time as well, such as his crossover with the freaking Avalanches on their track Wherever You Go, making for some of the wildest, most out-of-the-box shit I'd ever heard out of either them or him, or his appearance on former XX bandmate Romy's very solid solo album last year for that album's best track, Enjoy Your Life. Needless to say, the anticipation for a possible second Jamie XX album had only continued to rise more and more over all these years, and the moment it was finally announced, I basically immediately expected this to become my album of the year the second it would drop, which perhaps may not have been entirely reasonable to expect, but at the same time, it's not like there's exactly been much of any strong competition this year. Not until the Floating Points album came out would Jamie XX have had anything resembling a strong challenger. And after having sat with this for a while now, while this being my album of the year is still possible, I don't yet know for sure if it holds that honor. I think it's currently roughly about on par with that Floating Points thing, and it was actually a lot less immediate of a listen than I expected it to be. In fact, on my first listen, the night it dropped, I actually found it to be something of a letdown that didn't come near hitting the heights I was expecting it to, and it's needed this extra time to properly grow on me. I mean, I knew I wasn't going to be getting another In Color, nor did I really want that. And even though I'd mostly been avoiding the singles as they were dropping outside of maybe very small previews, just from those bits I knew exactly what kind of album In Waves was going to be, i.e., a throwback to classic 90s rave styles. I've seen people express their disappointment on that merit alone, given how simultaneously forward-thinking and emblematic of the time In Color was. But even if I don't think I could say anything about this album as necessarily forward-thinking, it is exactly as emblematic of the time and scene it was released in as In Color was. 90s rave and house throwbacks have in fact seen a major uptick over the past couple of years, to the point where house has become like the primary flavor of mainstream adjacent electronic releases in the 2020s. It's an already existing wave that Jamie XX just happened to be riding, albeit he did get on it before it really got to the ubiquitous level it's reached at this point. In fact, as I kinda went over when I covered the Floating Points thing, there's been so many house throwbacks over the past couple of years that I've even started to feel some burnout on house music and have felt like electronic music as a whole genre is in some need of some more new and fresh ideas that don't play so much to traditionalist formulas. And I think it was this very burnout with house revivalism that resulted in this album not entirely clicking with me on first listen. But again, we are only talking about my first listen here. Everything here did eventually grow on me. By listen 5 or so, I was finally getting the level of experience out of this album that I actually went in wanting to get, and it stayed around that level for most of the subsequent listens as well. What this album might lack in terms of creativity, it could make up for in terms of its hooks and how easily memorable from a distance everything is. More than half the track listing on this thing has gotten lodged in my head longer term, in the good way, and the ones that didn't have their own separate things to like about them. Nearly the entire track listing on this thing has gotten lodged in my head longer term, in the good way, and the tracks that didn't have their own separate things to like about them. So, let's talk about what actually goes into this thing. The album does start out kind of unassumingly with the intro Wanna. While there is definitely a striking idea here with that wailing vocal sample going over some very spare beats and pianos, it's very easy to get stuck in my head, and I do appreciate him having muffled the sound of that stock air horn in the beginning to prevent that from being annoying. Again, this does just feel like an intro and warm-up before the album is started up proper. We're not exactly starting on the same level of an opener as Gosh. However, from there we do immediately directly segue into the album's functional opener, Treat Each Other Right. I had no idea what to make of this track when I first heard it, as we abruptly switched between sections of these somewhat harsh, high-pitched vocal samples going over standard 90s breakbeats and wobbly bass, and other sections that bringing a completely different pitched-up soul sample, which seems mildly Kanye-inspired, and just letting that sit out there in the open. It's a very strange track that on the surface seems kinda clunky and thrown together in its construction. Though, on the other hand, clearly there's more thought put into it than it might seem on the surface, since this is easily the catchiest track on the album. This one has gotten stuck in my head for a full day once, complete with the awkward jump in tempo and mixing that comes with that sample introduction, and it went from being something of a head scratcher to being the most likely track to pop into my mind if I think about this album in passing. Which honestly, I do see that as a good sign. It does feel like there is some unspoken method to its madness that just gets it all to click somehow that I can't fully put into words. Also, to be fair, there are other tracks on this album that are even more odd or puzzling in their construction than this one, but we'll get to those later. Next up, we got Waited All Night, which is a full VXX reunion featuring vocals from both Romy and Oliver Sim. It's really nice and spacious, both of them provide just as soulful vocal performances as you'd expect, and is a heck of a lot more upbeat than any of the tracks featuring their appearances on In Color. There's a lot of breezy breakbeat workouts going through this one that put it in somewhat similar territory to the kind of stuff Romy was doing on her solo album. I think there's even a very minor reprise of one of the samples from Kill Them being repurposed in a less intrusive manner, which is neat because this is obviously a far better track that goes beyond just sounding like a commercial or something. So that's definitely a highlight. And then we get the album's lead single, Baddy on the Floor, in collaboration with producer Honey Dijon. This was the only track I heard in its full entirety before the album released, and I think was the primary reason why my expectations for this thing stayed so consistently high. Because this is like such an inhumanly, fantastically well-made house banger. The way we go from all these stomping beats and house pianos with all those deep-voiced spoken sample chops, even further accentuating the rhythms and beats and grooves and making them even more danceable. All of that is before all these awesome 70s disco horn sections get inserted and bring up the excitement level to 11, or the breakdowns in certain parts that bring in some disco strings. And we even get that cliche where the music just cuts out completely for exactly one beat to make way for a sample saying the word stop on 3 separate occasions, including the very final moment of the track because, of course. And that even further helps raise the excitement level, a perfect reminder of why Todd in the Shadows is so obsessed with that cliche as he is. I've got nothing but, like, the highest praises for this track. This has given me, like, similar vibes to when I was obsessed with Basement Jacks back in the day, and like, I feel like this is going to go down as one of the best dance tracks of the entire decade. It is so damn good. It's also probably my favorite track on the album, which maybe might be a tiny bit disappointing in itself. But if it is, it's not by a long shot, and there is some definite competition for that spot. Next we got Daffodil, consistently misspelled with one F for whatever reason, and featuring the vocals of Kelsey Lou, John Glacier, and Panda Bear. This is another track that I mostly just found kind of odd and puzzling and had no idea what to make of at first, and needed to slowly grow on me. It's probably the track that grew on me the slowest and most gradually as well, because it felt so odd and disjointed as all the different vocal performances and samples felt like they were just flying at me at random without ever coming together into something greater than the sum of their parts. The only thing holding all these disparate elements together was this really sparse beat and a melancholy Motown sounding sample that didn't make for nearly enough of a structure to allow me to wrap my head around it easily. I do, however, feel like that core sample, taken from Astrud Gilberto's cover of Touching You by Debbie Taylor, was the very element that allowed this track to eventually grow on me. All the other musical elements and vocal guests are basically just extra flavor coming in direct service of that sample, and it is a really dang nice sample that hits a strong emotional note, even if it's not among the most immediate of hooks on display on this album. And speaking of tracks somewhat reliant on presumably expensive samples, Still Summer is apparently based on a sample of Nights in White Satin by the Moody Blues. Now, of course, anyone who's been paying attention to this channel in the past 2 months will know why that likely got me excited from the moment I saw Justin Hayward's name in the credits of this album. Although, as much as Nights in White Satin is an extremely formative track to me, I would not have guessed this track sampled it if I didn't already know. It's barely noticeable at all from how warped and sidechained it's been, turning this originally extremely sad and longing track into something that feels much more lighthearted and cheerful, complete with bright trance-ish synth stabs all over the place. Honestly, the first thing I thought of when I heard this track for the first time wasn't the Moody Blues, but rather that the sound of this track reminded me of the artist Spunkshine. To be fair, I cannot imagine Jamie XX knows who Spunkshine is, and there's almost no chance he was intentionally taking inspiration from that guy, but still, the way those guitars and mellotrons were warped and sidechained came off in such a specific way that brought to mind Spunkshine tracks like Striding the Blast or maybe Huge Humans. check out that guy's Memory is Something Fast and Elemental if you've never heard it before, by the way, since it's also amazing. And going from there, we get another one of the top contenders for best track on the album in Life, featuring Robin. Pretty much got into this for the exact same reason as Baddy on the Floor, in that those horn sections are just so damn crisp and exciting, and the way they go up against those big thumping house beats and crazy stutter edits. It all has so much infectious punch and energy. Robin's vocals very much come secondary to the instrumental, as has kind of been the running theme for the guest appearances on this entire album, though she definitely brings enough attitude and flair to further give the track even more life, as it were. From here, the album starts to deliver a few lower energy moments to balance things out a bit. We get The Feeling I Get From You, which admittedly kind of reads to me as a little fillerish in context, but, you know, still makes for a nice little emotional moment. And I do quite like how all the half-spoken sample chops go up against all those very pretty piano progressions. It's the kind of thing that could have been like a middle-tier transitional track on The Avalanche's We Will Always Love You. One of those tracks like Overcome, for instance, that obviously is not a main event, but, you know, generally keeps up the vibe well enough and won't be a skip. That may sound like faint praise, but obviously, if you know me, any parallel to the Avalanches is a good thing in my books. And then, of course, we get Breather right after that, although that cuts a lot less of a moment of respite for the album than you'd expect from its title. Actually, it's probably the album's single most experimental moment of all, going on a 6-minute odyssey through drum and bass-inspired progressions, mildly industrial synths building from sparse and unnerving near emptiness into much brighter and more dramatic melodic builds, occasional spoken snippets trying to give the track more of a meditative edge, I guess, and a change up at the end into much more of a standard techno beat to match the tempo of the rest of the album. Surprisingly epic stuff here. Now, that takes us to another one of the big singles, All You Children. A track which I intentionally avoided aside from hearing a bit of the intro, since it's another crossover with none other than the Avalanches themselves. I was so damn hyped for this one. One of my favorite bands of all time crossing over again on my most anticipated album of the year. And last time they worked together on Wherever You Go, the results were nothing short of absolutely stellar, both figuratively and literally. And getting to hear them coming together again for this track turned out to be pretty good, I guess. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think this actually turned out to be my least favorite track on the album. Again, very close call if that. I still think the track is quite good, and it took several listens before I ended up settling on it, taking that spot over cuts like Wanna or The Feeling I Get From You. But yeah, this kind of just reads to me as a less interesting retread of what they did together on Wherever You Go. Kind of similar use of the children's choir samples and the heavy bass and house beats, but being applied to a way more straightforward arrangement that doesn't really change or evolve to nearly the same wild extent that their previous crossover did, and as a result doesn't have any of the same mind-bending appeal for me. Also, the drops on this one aren't really the strongest or hardest hitting. They're not quite as full-sounding or exciting as many other tracks on this album. Again, to make it clear, not being as interesting as Wherever You Go is not saying much, and this is still a fun and quirky banger regardless. If this is the worst the album has to offer, I think that says more about how much quality I felt the rest of the album delivers. But I did go into this album really wanting this track in particular to be one of my biggest favorites, and that did not turn out to be the case. In the greater context of the album, it's just kind of there and didn't really stand out that much for me. Bizarrely, the one track on the album most likely to fall into the background. Heck, I think I actually got more out of the interlude every single weekend that directly connects to it, since that strips itself down more to bring in more melodic textures that hit a noticeably stronger emotional note. That comes a little bit closer to the kind of note that I would want another Jamie XX and the Avalanches crossover to hit. But anyway, that minor letdown aside, that leaves the closer, Falling Together, featuring spoken word from Una Doherty. On first listen to the album, this was my easy least favorite track, since the spoken word extolling the importance of the dance floor and generally calling for peace and love throughout the world struck me as kind of fake deep and corny. But as per usual, the instrumental ended up being the primary thing carrying this track, and I kind of stopped paying attention to the spoken word altogether after enough listens. The chord progressions of bright synth stabs, chopped up guitars, and well-layered chilling ambient pads going up next to the marching beats made for one of the strongest emotional moments for this album that made it really well-fitting as a climactic finish for this entire album. Also, there's some fun acid breakdowns in some parts that are nicely implemented as well. So yeah, there we go. That is everything on Jamie XX's In Waves. No, it is not as good as In Color, but that's not saying much, and I'm certainly satisfied with the journey I was taken on regardless. And I mean, to be fair, it's not like In Color was an immediate hitter either. It took the better part of a full decade for that album to grow on me to the point where I felt it was a genuine all-timer instead of just a regular old great album. Perhaps this will also need more years of hindsight and history to really sink into becoming something more easily comparable. Maybe this album will help inspire a new wave of artists who want to do more crate digging with old school soul samples and stuff, and this ends up somewhat predictive of that. It's not impossible. I mean, I've heard Pretty Lights might be making a comeback soon, so that might help an idea like that along, even though I'm currently very much of the I'll believe it when I see it mood around the idea of that guy releasing a new album. I feel like I'm making a big stretch here. Like, the idea of this album making the same kind of lasting impact In Color did seems doubtful right now, but my point is there's no real way to predict that. At the very least, even if the more likely outcome of this just being another really strong rave throwback to add on to all the other really strong throwback dance music we've been getting throughout the 2020s, instead of a generational electronic classic comes to pass, there's obviously nothing wrong with that. And, I mean, just as how I felt with that new Floating Points album, I also wouldn't be surprised if years down the line I look back on this album as one of the notable highlights of this whole throwback-centric era of electronic music, with how much Jamie XX's passion for all things 90s rave shows through, and all the creative and catchy ideas he does pack into this thing. Regardless of any possible misgivings I might have, this is still a comeback I'm very glad to live in a universe where it finally happened at all and delivered as much quality as it did, so as not to make me lose any bit of the insane respect I had for Jamie XX's place in this genre. If by some chance you still haven't heard it, I can definitely sign off on it very much being worth your time as one of the best electronic albums of the year, and I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.